The morning of August 28, 2014, began not with the foreboding of a medical emergency, but with the typical, high-octane energy that defined Joan Rivers' life. At 81 years old, Joan was not a woman entering her twilight years, she was a woman in the middle of a massive career resurgence. Between her starring role on E!'s Fashion Police, her web series In Bed with Joan, and a grueling schedule of live stand-up dates, her voice was her most valuable asset. It was a raspy, iconic instrument that she used to dismantle the egos of Hollywood's elite. To the public, Joan was indestructible, a force of nature who had survived personal tragedy, financial ruin, and the cutthroat nature of show business. However, she was deeply protective of the tools of her trade. A persistent hoarseness and a nagging discomfort caused by acid reflux, common in someone who lived on coffee and stress, had begun to worry her. She wasn't seeking a miracle, she was seeking a tune-up. She walked into Yorkville Endoscopy, a boutique outpatient facility on Manhattan's Upper East Side, with the expectation that she would be back home in her opulent penthouse by lunch. She was accompanied by her trusted circle, and her mood was reported to be light, even joking with the medical staff as she was prepped for the procedure. But beneath the surface of this routine appointment, a series of dangerous variables were beginning to align in a way that would rewrite medical safety laws across the country. The choice of Yorkville Endoscopy was a strategic one, intended to provide the privacy a celebrity of her stature required. However, the very prestige of the patient created a toxic environment for clinical safety. In the medical field, VIP syndrome is a recognized phenomenon where the standard, rigid boundaries of medical protocol are eroded by the fame of the person on the table. When a legend like Joan Rivers enters a clinic, the doctors and nurses often cease to see a patient and begin to see a persona. This psychological shift can lead to catastrophic lapses in judgment. Decisions that would be made objectively for an average citizen become clouded by a desire to provide special treatment or to be part of the celebrity's inner circle. At Yorkville, the atmosphere was reportedly more like a social gathering of high-profile specialists than a sterile surgical environment. This erosion of professional distance was the first and perhaps most significant failure of the day. The medical team gathered in the procedure room consisted of veterans in their fields, but the hierarchy was dangerously blurred. Dr. Lawrence Cohen, the clinic's medical director, was a renowned gastroenterologist. Alongside him was Dr. Gwen Corrivan, Joan's personal ear, nose, and throat doctor. Dr. Corrivan was known as the doctor to the stars, having treated the vocal cords of world-class singers and actors. However, she was not an official member of the Yorkville staff and did not have privileges to perform surgery at this specific facility. In any other scenario, a doctor without privileges would be barred from touching a patient in a surgical suite. Yet, because of Joan's status and Corrivan's reputation, the rules were simply ignored. This lack of a clear chain of command meant that no one was effectively in charge of the room's safety. When everyone is a star doctor, the essential checks and balances that prevent errors are often the first things to be discarded. The errors began with the most basic administrative tasks. Before any sedative is administered, a patient must be weighed accurately to calculate the correct dosage of drugs. For a petite, 81-year-old woman with a history of heart arrhythmia, this step is not a suggestion, it is a life-saving requirement. Yet, the clinic failed to record Joan's weight on the morning of the procedure. They were essentially guessing her mass, and by extension, guessing the amount of propofol her heart could withstand. Propofol is a powerful anesthetic, famously linked to the death of Michael Jackson, and while it is safe when used correctly, it is unforgiving of mistakes. It suppresses the respiratory system, meaning the person administering it must be prepared to take over the patient's breathing at a second's notice. In the casual, distracted environment of the Yorkville suite, the weight of this responsibility seemed to be secondary to the novelty of the moment. The plan for the morning was a gastroscopy, a procedure where a flexible camera is inserted down the throat to examine the stomach and esophagus. Joan had signed the consent forms for this specific checkup. However, once she was under sedation, the scope of the procedure shifted. Dr. Corrivan allegedly decided to perform a laryngoscopy, an examination of the vocal cords, which was not part of the documented consent. This was not a minor deviation, it was a fundamental breach of medical ethics. The human throat is one of the most sensitive areas of the body, and the vocal cords are guarded by a powerful involuntary reflex. When instruments are introduced to this area under light sedation, the body can react violently. This reaction is known as a laryngospasm, where the vocal cords slam shut to protect the lungs. Once a laryngospasm occurs, the patient is effectively being strangled from the inside. As the procedure progressed, the focus of the medical team drifted further from the patient's vitals and toward the performance of the doctors. According to the lawsuits that followed, the room was filled with the sound of chatter rather than the rhythmic monitoring of a life. It was during this time that the most shocking allegations of the case emerged, the Selfie incident. Reports suggested that Dr. Cohen took a photograph of the unconscious Joan Rivers while she was on the table, allegedly to show her later in the recovery room. If true, this act represents a total collapse of medical dignity and professionalism. While the doctors were distracted by the celebrity on their table, the monitors were beginning to show the first signs of a crisis. Joan's oxygen levels were starting to dip, and her heart rate was beginning to fluctuate, yet the team continued with the unauthorized maneuvers. The medical science of what happened next is a grim progression of biological failure. When the laryngospasm occurred, Joan's airway was sealed. In an 81-year-old body, the heart and brain have very little reserve. They cannot withstand even a few minutes of oxygen deprivation without suffering permanent damage. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Renuka Bankola, reportedly expressed concern that the procedure was interfering with Joan's ability to breathe, but her warnings were allegedly dismissed by Dr. Cohen. This is a classic symptom of a toxic medical hierarchy. The person responsible for the airway is overruled by the surgeon who wants to finish the procedure. By the time the team realized that Joan was not just having a minor respiratory hiccup but was in the middle of a full-scale cardiac arrest, it was already too late. The golden minutes, the critical window where a patient can be resuscitated without brain damage, were ticking away while the doctors in the room were reportedly in a state of denial. They attempted to use a bag mask ventilator to force air into her lungs, but against the sealed wall of a laryngospasm, this was useless. The standard emergency protocol for such a blockage is a cricothyrotomy, an emergency incision in the throat to create a new airway. Yet, despite having the tools and the expertise in the room, this procedure was never performed. It was as if the gravity of who was on the table had paralyzed their ability to act as emergency physicians. They were treating a legend, and they couldn't bring themselves to damage her with an emergency incision, even if it meant saving her life. By the time 911 was called, the situation had transitioned from a medical error into a full-blown catastrophe. The ambulance was called nearly 12 minutes after the code blue was first initiated internally. In the world of emergency medicine, 12 minutes is an eternity. During those 12 minutes, Joan Rivers' brain was being starved of the oxygen it needed to function. The heart, deprived of fuel, had slowed to a crawl and eventually stopped. The woman who had just hours earlier been laughing and planning her next television appearance was now a victim of a series of small, ego-driven decisions that had added up to a death sentence. The first part of this documentary is a study in the danger of exceptionalism. Joan Rivers died because she was treated as an exception to the rules. The clinic, the doctors, and the staff all operated under the delusion that the standard laws of biology and medical safety didn't apply to a superstar. They skipped the way in, they ignored the lack of privileges, they performed unauthorized procedures, and they took photographs while their patient's life force was draining away. As the paramedics finally arrived and began the desperate work of resuscitation, the tragedy of Joan Rivers was no longer a medical mystery, it was a documented failure of human judgment. The transition from a routine medical procedure to a life and death struggle is rarely as instantaneous as it appears in cinema. Instead, it is a slow, agonizing erosion of safety margins that occurs while those in the room remain blissfully unaware, or willfully ignorant, of the shifting tide. At Yorkville Endoscopy, that tide turned at approximately 9:12 a.m. Inside the procedure room, the technological safety nets were already beginning to scream for attention, though their warnings were met with a baffling lack of urgency. Joan Rivers' oxygen saturation, the vital measure of the life-giving gas being carried through her bloodstream to her brain, had begun its steady, terrifying descent. From a healthy baseline of 100, it dipped to 92, then plateaued briefly, before plunging into the 80s, 70s, and eventually hitting a floor of 47. In the highly controlled environment of an anesthesia-led procedure, a drop below 90 is a siren, a drop to 47 is a death knell. For a staggering 14 minutes, the medical staff reportedly failed to acknowledge the severity of this collapse. Her blood pressure cratered from a healthy 117/60 to a weak 84/40. The woman who had built a career on being the loudest voice in the room was now experiencing a silent, internal catastrophe. What followed was a masterclass in clinical chaos and a total breakdown of the timeout protocols designed to protect patients. As Joan's larynx seized in a laryngospasm, that involuntary, ironclad grip of the vocal cords intended to protect the lungs from perceived intrusion, her airway became an impenetrable wall. At this precise moment, the room should have transformed into an engine of high-stakes resuscitation. The standard medical response for a blocked airway in an outpatient setting is clear: immediate cessation of the procedure, administration of paralytics like succinylcholine to break the spasm, and if all else fails, a cricothyrotomy, a surgical opening of the neck to bypass the obstruction. However, this emergency response was never initiated. Instead, the room was paralyzed by a lack of leadership and a toxic culture of VIP deference. Dr. Gwen Corrivan, the ENT specialist who had been performing the unauthorized vocal cord maneuvers, was in a precarious legal and professional position. She didn't have the privileges to be operating in that clinic. According to later legal allegations, when the situation turned dire, the focus shifted from saving the patient to managing the potential fallout of her presence. The groupie mentality that had permeated the room during the selfie phase had now turned into a fog of panic and indecision. The timeline of the resuscitation efforts, as reconstructed by federal investigators from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, reveals a maze of conflicting medical records that suggest a frantic attempt to retroactively manage the narrative. One clinic record states that CPR and chest compressions began at 9:28 a.m., yet another set of notes suggests that the administration of life-saving drugs like epinephrine and atropine didn't occur until 9:38 a.m. This 10-minute discrepancy is not a mere clerical error, it represents the difference between a recoverable event and permanent, catastrophic brain damage. While Joan lay on the table, her brain was being starved of oxygen, a condition known as anoxic encephalopathy. Every second that passed without a clear airway was a second where her cognitive essence, her wit, her memories, her very self, was being erased. Despite the presence of high-profile specialists, the room lacked the one thing it needed most: an advocate for the patient who was willing to stop the show and start the survival effort. By the time the 911 call was finally placed at 9:40 a.m., Joan had been without sufficient oxygen for nearly 30 minutes. The emergency call itself was a chilling admission of how far the situation had deteriorated. The clinic staff reported a patient in cardiac and respiratory arrest. When the New York Fire Department paramedics arrived at the East 93rd Street facility at 9:45 a.m., they found a scene of utter desperation. They immediately took over the chest compressions and managed to insert a breathing tube, finally bypassing the spasm that had doomed her. They managed to restore a faint, thready pulse, but the damage was likely already permanent. Joan was stabilized just enough to be moved, but she was no longer the vibrant woman who had walked into the clinic that morning. She was a body kept alive by machines, being rushed through the humid Manhattan morning toward the intensive care unit at Mount Sinai Hospital. As the ambulance sped toward Mount Sinai, the news of the emergency began to leak to the public, igniting a global media firestorm. The initial reports were cautiously worded: Joan Rivers rushed to hospital for observations, but the reality inside the emergency room was grim. Joan arrived at Mount Sinai in a state of profound coma. She was immediately placed on life support, her body cooled in a process known as therapeutic hypothermia, an attempt to minimize the metabolic demand on her damaged brain and prevent further swelling. For the outside world, there was a desperate, flickering hope. Joan was a fighter, a woman who had survived every professional and personal blow life had thrown at her. But for the medical team at Mount Sinai and for her daughter, Melissa, who had rushed from Los Angeles to be by her side, the neurological exams told a different story. The routine checkup had resulted in a catastrophic neurological collapse that no amount of modern medicine could reverse. The days that followed were a vigil of mounting dread and heartbreaking decisions. While fans gathered in the street outside the hospital, holding signs and lighting candles, the investigation into Yorkville Endoscopy was already beginning in the shadows. The Department of Health and federal investigators were moving in to secure records and interview staff, sensing that this was more than just a tragic accident. Inside the ICU, Melissa Rivers faced the agonizing reality that her mother had left clear instructions regarding her quality of life. Joan had always been adamant: she never wanted to live if she couldn't go on stage for an hour and be funny. As the tests confirmed that Joan would never regain consciousness or the ability to communicate, the path forward became clear, though no less painful. On September 4, 2014, 1 week after she had walked into the clinic, the decision was made to remove Joan from life support. The transition was handled with the dignity that had been so lacking in the procedure room at Yorkville. Melissa climbed into the hospital bed and held her mother as the ventilators were silenced. The Queen of Comedy passed away quietly, leaving behind a void in the entertainment world and a legacy of questions that would haunt the medical community for years. The investigation would soon reveal that the medical error was not a single mistake, but a systemic failure of ego over protocol. The autopsy would eventually label the cause of death as therapeutic complication, a sterile term for a death that was, in the eyes of many, entirely preventable. The descent into silence was complete, but the roar of the legal and regulatory battle was only just beginning. The death of Joan Rivers was not merely a tragedy for the world of entertainment, it became a catalyst for one of the most exhaustive medical investigations in the history of New York State. While the public mourned, federal and state investigators were descending upon Yorkville Endoscopy, piecing together a timeline that would eventually expose a systematic collapse of medical standards. The investigation was spearheaded by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, in conjunction with the New York State Department of Health. The result was a chilling, 18-page report that stripped away the clinic's polished Upper East Side facade and revealed a facility where ego and celebrity deference had effectively replaced the rule of law. To understand the gravity of Part 3, one must look at the specific, granular failures identified by investigators, failures that transformed a routine, therapeutic session into a fatal encounter. The first major finding of the federal report centered on the fundamental concept of informed consent. In the medical world, consent is the bedrock of the patient-physician relationship. It ensures that the patient understands exactly what is being done to their body and what the risks are. According to the investigation, Joan Rivers had only provided written consent for an upper endoscopy, a procedure to look at her esophagus and stomach. However, the records indicated that her personal ENT, Dr. Gwen Corrivan, had performed not one, but 2 transnasal laryngoscopies during the session. These procedures, which involve threading a scope through the nose to view the vocal cords, were never authorized in writing by Joan. This breach of protocol suggested a freestyle approach to surgery, where the presence of a doctor to the stars allowed the clinic to bypass the legal requirements that apply to every other patient in the country. The report noted that Dr. Corrivan was not even a member of the Yorkville medical staff and did not have privileges to perform procedures there. She was, for all intents and purposes, a guest in the room who took it upon herself to operate on a sedated patient without the legal right to do so. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation in the investigation involved the behavior of the medical director, Dr. Lawrence Cohen. It was alleged that during the procedure, while Joan was unconscious, Dr. Cohen used his cell phone to take a photograph, a selfie, of himself and Dr. Corrivan with the legendary comedian. This act was cited by federal investigators as a gross violation of patient privacy and a sign of a total lack of professionalism. It painted a picture of a room where the doctors had become groupies, more interested in documenting their proximity to fame than in monitoring the life force of the person on the table. This distraction was not just a matter of poor taste, it was a distraction that likely delayed the recognition of Joan's deteriorating vital signs. While the camera was out, Joan's oxygen levels were beginning to plummet, and her heart was starting to fail. The investigation suggested that the staff's focus was so fractured that they missed the critical window where intervention could have saved her life. The medical examiner's report, released on October 16, 2014, provided the forensic backbone to the federal investigation. The official cause of death was listed as anoxic encephalopathy due to hypoxic arrest. In layman's terms, her brain died because it was deprived of oxygen during a cardiac arrest. However, the most controversial part of the report was the manner of death, which was classified as a therapeutic complication. This phrasing ignited a firestorm of debate. To the medical examiner, a therapeutic complication means the death resulted from a predictable risk of medical therapy. In this case, the risk was a laryngospasm, the sudden closing of the vocal cords. However, the legal and public interpretation was vastly different. For Melissa Rivers and her legal team, a predictable complication does not mean an unavoidable one. If a complication is predictable, it means the doctors should have been prepared to handle it. The fact that the clinic had no clear protocol for a laryngospasm, and that the doctors failed to perform an emergency cricothyrotomy, an incision in the neck to open an airway, suggested that the complication only became fatal because of medical incompetence. The investigation also took a deep dive into the administration of propofol, the powerful sedative that has become a household name due to its role in the death of Michael Jackson. At Yorkville, the record-keeping regarding propofol was a shambles. One set of records indicated that Joan had received 300 milligrams of the drug, a massive dose for an 81-year-old woman. However, the anesthesiologist later claimed this was a clerical error and that only 120 milligrams had been administered. This discrepancy suggested a terrifying lack of precision in a procedure where every milligram counts. Furthermore, the investigation found that the clinic failed to record Joan's weight before the procedure, a critical oversight because propofol dosing is strictly mass-dependent. Without a weight, the anesthesiologist was essentially eyeballing the dosage for a high-risk elderly patient. As the 18-page report made its way through the hands of state regulators, the consequences for Yorkville Endoscopy were swift and severe. The clinic was cited for dozens of deficiencies, ranging from failing to ensure patient rights to having an inadequate quality assurance program. The federal government moved to terminate the clinic's Medicare and Medicaid accreditation, a death blow for any outpatient facility. The report essentially argued that Yorkville was not a medical facility in the traditional sense, but a high-end boutique that had abandoned the boring but essential safety checks of a hospital. The investigation highlighted a culture of silence within the room where the anesthesiologist, Dr. Renuka Bankola, reportedly expressed concerns about the procedure but was overruled by the senior doctors. This breakdown in communication is a classic human factor failure often seen in plane crashes and nuclear disasters. A junior staff member sees a problem but is too intimidated by the hierarchy to stop the catastrophe. The final piece of the investigative puzzle was the autopsy's look at Joan's heart. Despite her age and her known history of arrhythmia, her heart was found to be relatively healthy for her age. She didn't die because her heart gave out on its own, she died because her heart was forced to stop by the lack of oxygen. This finding placed the blame squarely on the management of her airway. The investigation concluded that there was a minimum of 14 minutes between the time Joan's oxygen dropped and the time any significant resuscitation effort began. 14 minutes is an eternity in the world of hypoxia. The brain begins to die after only 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen. This timeline confirmed the worst fears of the Rivers family, that Joan had been left to suffocate on a surgical table while the doctors around her were either distracted, paralyzed by ego, or simply out of their depth. The death of Joan Rivers on September 4, 2014, was not the end of her story, rather, it was the beginning of a relentless quest for accountability that would expose the dark underbelly of boutique medicine and lead to sweeping changes in how outpatient surgical centers are regulated across the United States. While the world mourned the loss of a comedic icon, her daughter, Melissa Rivers, found herself thrust into a role she never asked for, that of a whistleblower and an advocate for patient safety. The grief of losing her mother was compounded by the growing realization that Joan's death was not an act of God or a result of her age, but the direct consequence of what her legal team would eventually describe as medical mismanagement, incompetency, and outrageous behavior. Part 4 examines the landmark legal battle that followed, the startling details that emerged during discovery, and the legislative legacy, often referred to as Joan's Law, that aims to ensure no other family has to suffer the same preventable tragedy. In January 2015, Melissa Rivers filed a multi-million-dollar medical malpractice and wrongful death lawsuit in the New York Supreme Court against Yorkville Endoscopy and the 5 physicians involved in her mother's care. The lawsuit was more than a demand for financial damages, it was a forensic dismantling of the VIP culture that had permeated the clinic on East 93rd Street. The legal filings alleged that the doctors had acted like groupies rather than medical professionals, focusing on the novelty of treating a superstar instead of the basic biological needs of a patient under sedation. One of the most damning aspects of the suit was the confirmation of the Selfie allegations, that Dr. Lawrence Cohen had indeed used his cell phone to photograph the unconscious comedian. This act was not just a violation of HIPAA privacy laws, it was presented by the legal team as physical evidence of a distracted and unprofessional environment where the patient's dignity and safety were secondary to the doctor's social status. As the case moved through the discovery phase, the medical community was forced to confront the reality of how thin the safety margins truly are in outpatient settings. The lawsuit highlighted that Yorkville Endoscopy, despite being an accredited facility, lacked the crash cart preparedness and the rigorous timeout protocols that are standard in major hospitals. The legal argument centered on the fact that when Joan's airway seized in a laryngospasm, the team was fundamentally unprepared to respond. Melissa's attorneys, Jeffrey Bloom and Ben Rubinowitz, argued that the physicians had ample opportunity to save Joan's life. If they had recognized the drop in oxygen sooner, if they had administered muscle relaxants to break the spasm, or if they had performed an emergency cricothyrotomy, Joan would likely have walked out of the clinic that afternoon. The suit claimed that the doctor's refusal to acknowledge the crisis, driven by a desire to finish an unauthorized vocal cord procedure, constituted gross negligence. In May 2016, after more than a year of intense legal maneuvering, the parties reached a settlement. While the exact financial terms remained confidential, legal experts estimated the payout to be in the substantial eight-figure range, potentially exceeding $10 million. However, for Melissa Rivers, the victory was never about the money. In a statement following the settlement, she emphasized that the goal was to force a change in the industry. The settlement allowed the doctors to avoid a public trial, but it did not shield the clinic from the fallout. Yorkville Endoscopy eventually lost its federal accreditation and, under the weight of the investigation and the public scandal, was forced to overhaul its management and clinical staff. The case sent a shockwave through the world of ambulatory surgery centers, ASCs, which had seen a massive rise in popularity due to their lower costs and perceived convenience. The most enduring legacy of this tragedy is the push for legislative reform. Joan's death highlighted a dangerous, regulatory gap in New York and many other states, where outpatient clinics were held to lower safety standards than traditional hospitals. Melissa Rivers began working with legislators in Albany to advocate for a series of reforms that have become known as the Joan Rivers Law. These measures aim to mandate that all outpatient facilities performing procedures under deep sedation follow the same rigorous reporting and safety guidelines as hospital-based surgical suites. This includes mandatory reporting of never events, medical errors that should never happen, such as operating on a patient without written consent or failing to monitor vital signs accurately. It also advocates for the presence of a board-certified anesthesiologist whose sole responsibility is to monitor the patient, ensuring they are never overruled by a surgeon who may be distracted by the procedure itself. The medical industry has already begun to internalize the lessons from Joan. Her death is now used as a primary case study in medical schools and residency programs to illustrate the dangers of VIP syndrome. It serves as a reminder that fame does not confer immunity to the laws of physiology and that special treatment, in a medical context, is often the most dangerous treatment a person can receive. The case has led to a nationwide reevaluation of how doctors interact with high-profile patients, stressing the need for psychological safety, the ability for a junior nurse or anesthesiologist to speak up and stop a procedure without fear of retribution from a senior, star doctor. Ultimately, the question posed at the beginning of this documentary, was it just a medical error, has been answered by the weight of the evidence. It was not just a medical error, it was a systemic collapse of professional ethics and clinical protocol. It was a failure of leadership, a failure of oversight, and a failure of human decency. Joan Rivers spent her life making people see the uncomfortable truth through her comedy. In her death, she forced the world to look at the uncomfortable truth of a medical system that can, in its pursuit of profit and prestige, forget the humanity of the person on the table. Joan Rivers died as she lived, making a massive impact. Her final act was to shine a bright, unforgiving light on the flaws of outpatient medicine, potentially saving thousands of lives through the reforms she inspired. While the stage is quieter without her, the halls of medicine are arguably safer. She remains the queen of comedy, but she is also now a patron saint of patient safety. Her story serves as a permanent warning to the medical profession: no patient is a VIP when they are under anesthesia, they are simply a human being in need of care, and that care must never be compromised for the sake of a selfie or a celebrity's approval.